The 19th century was just an era of explosive, massive change. You had the Industrial Revolution, forging this whole new world of factories and, for some, incredible wealth. But for millions of others, it meant brutal working conditions and soul-crushing poverty. So in this explainer, we're going to dive into the incredible story of how ordinary people fought back. And that really brings us to the central question here. What happens when progress moves too fast? When innovation outpaces our sense of humanity? Who stands up for the people left behind? Well, the 19th century basically became this huge, continent-wide experiment in trying to answer that exact question.
You know, a good way to think about this era is like a giant pressure cooker. The heat, that's industrialization, and the pressure just kept building and building, from social inequality, from people being shut out of politics, and from just sheer economic exploitation. Something had to give. And this wasn't about making small tweaks. This was about people trying to fundamentally reshape the world they lived in.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with that industrial shockwave that really kicked everything off. Then we'll see how that led to politics for the people and the incredible power of unions. After that, we'll look at movements that were challenging the status quo in some really radical ways and the rise of humanity's new conscience before we wrap it all up by looking at the legacy of these reforms.
Okay, so first up, let's talk politics. As industrialization created this massive new working class, all crammed into cities, the pressure to give them the right to vote became unstoppable. And once more people, especially working-class men, could actually cast a ballot, well, the entire game of politics had to be reinvented from the ground up. Right, and this slide just shows that seismic shift so clearly. Politics went from being this sort of closed-off club for the wealthy elite whose main goal was just protecting their own land and assets to a totally different beast. It became a competitive arena where these new mass parties had to actually win over millions of voters. And how do you do that? Well, you have to promise to make their lives better.
And you can see exactly how that played out here. In Britain, the Liberal Party suddenly realized, hey, we've got to offer things like national education and public health if we want to compete. Over in Germany, the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, they showed that you could work inside the system to get real gradual gains for workers. So the really crucial point here is that the role of the state itself was changing. It wasn't just a night watchman for the rich anymore. It was becoming a provider for the many.
All right, let's move on, because while the politicians were scrambling to adapt, workers on the ground were organizing themselves. They were building a totally new kind of power, starting right there on the factory floor.
I mean, just try to imagine it for a second. You're working 14-hour days in a factory that's loud, dangerous, for just pennies. If you get hurt, you're fired. You complain, you're fired. As one person, you had absolutely zero power against the factory owner. And it was that reality, that complete powerlessness, that sparked the union movement. And this timeline just shows you the key turning points. First, 1870 in England. The right to strike is legalized. This is huge. It basically gives workers their single most powerful weapon. And then you see it in action. The Match Girls strike in '88, and then the massive London dock workers strike a year later. These events proved that by standing together, workers could literally grind the economy to a halt and force the bosses to come to the negotiating table.
And just look at the result of all that struggle. By the time World War I rolled around, you had about 4 million British workers in a union. I mean, that is a staggering number. It represents a fundamental shift in the entire balance of economic power, away from just individuals and towards this powerful collective force.
But you know what? They didn't stop at the picket line. The unions realized that to create change that would actually last, they needed a voice where the laws were made. And so, political parties like the British Labour Party were born, created directly by unions to fight for workers' rights, not just in the factory, but in Parliament itself.
Now, this fight for reform wasn't just about class and economics. It was also about gender. A new, powerful movement started to bubble up, one that began to challenge the fundamental legal and social structures that were holding women back.
So the first wave of this fight was really about basic legal identity. At the time, if a woman got married, pretty much all of her property, her earnings, even her legal self, was just absorbed by her husband. So groups like the Ladies of Langham Place did this crucial, foundational work, campaigning for a woman's right to own her own property and to get an education.
But some thinkers saw an even deeper connection. Flora Tristan, who was a radical French socialist, she argued that the oppression of women and the exploitation of the working class, they were two sides of the same coin. Her ideas were way ahead of her time, but they really laid the groundwork for a broader vision of social justice.
And as the 20th century kicked off, the fight for the vote, for suffrage, it got way more intense. Emmeline Pankhurst's group, the WSPU, basically decided that asking politely just wasn't cutting it anymore. They adopted more militant tactics, escalating from mass demonstrations to civil disobedience and, when they were jailed, hunger strikes. Their goal was to make their cause absolutely impossible to ignore.
And that persistence, it paid off. In 1918, a pivotal law was passed in the UK. Now, it wasn't full equality just yet. The vote was granted to all men over 21, but only to women over 30 who met certain qualifications. Still, this was a massive crack in the wall of political exclusion. It was a monumental victory that paved the way for full suffrage just a decade later.
So, running parallel to all of this political and economic struggle, there was another powerful force at work, a kind of new social conscience. This was often driven by deep religious and moral convictions, and it took aim at some of the era's biggest injustices.
So take the Sunday school movement, for example. Now, this wasn't just about religion. Think about it. For kids working in factories 6 days a week, Sunday was often the only chance they had to learn how to read and write. And this massive volunteer effort had a huge effect, dramatically increasing literacy rates and empowering an entire generation of working-class people.
But perhaps the most profound moral crusade of the entire century was abolitionism. This was a movement fueled by the powerful conviction that slavery was just a stain on humanity. And activists like William Wilberforce organized one of the first truly modern international human rights campaigns to end it.
And they succeeded. In 1838, the British Empire abolished slavery. This was a landmark moment not just for the millions of people who were finally freed, but for the entire world. It set a completely new moral benchmark and proved that organized, passionate advocacy could actually dismantle a centuries-old system of oppression.
And the spirit of reform was just everywhere. You had the temperance movement, fighting against the devastating impact of alcoholism on families and society. And you had incredible campaigners like Josephine Butler, who took on unjust laws that punished and exploited vulnerable women, fighting for their basic human dignity.
So let's just pull all these threads together for a second. This table really summarizes the 4 key pillars we've been talking about. You've got mass politics, which turned the state into a provider of welfare. You've got labor unions, which won economic justice through collective action. Then there's feminism, fighting for legal and political equality. And finally, humanitarianism, driven by this new moral conscience. Each one was distinct, but together, they completely remade the modern world.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thought. The reformers of the 19th century rose up to meet the challenges created by their revolution, the Industrial Revolution. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? As we navigate our own era of rapid technological and social change, what are the unintended consequences we're creating right now? And who will be the reformers that rise up to challenge them?